The heat of the kitchen was a familiar blanket, thick with the scent of seared wagyu and truffle oil. Outside, in the hushed elegance of Murasake, Tokyo's elite dined under spotlights, so precise each plate became a stage. For Chloe, the transition between those two worlds was a deep breath and a pasted-on smile. She moved through the dining room, a silent shadow in a crisp black uniform, her tray held high and steady. Her focus was absolute, a shield against the low murmur of conversations she was paid to ignore, the glint of watches worth more than her apartment, the casual power that saturated the air like expensive cologne. She was refilling water glasses at a corner table when they arrived. The atmosphere in the room didn't just shift, it tilted on its axis, every molecule realigning toward the door. Chloe didn't need to look up to know. She felt it in the sudden stillness of the servers, the way the maitre d's posture became ramrod straight, his professional smile tightening at the edges. She finished her task, her movements economical, and turned. He stood in the entryway, a man carved from shadow and discipline. His suit was a dark gray Tom Ford, so perfectly tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. It was the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. It simply was. Two men flanked him, their own suits sharp but lacking the predatory grace of their leader. They were wolves, but he was the winter that commanded them. Chloe's eyes slid past him, a practiced habit of making herself invisible. But then she saw the woman on his arm. She was small and elderly, her silver hair styled in an elegant chignon, her frame draped in a simple, tasteful beige dress. She looked lost, her eyes wide as she took in the cavernous, modern dining room. There was a fragile confusion in her posture that snagged something in Chloe's chest, a flicker of empathy that momentarily overrode her professional detachment. The maitre d' led them toward the largest private room, the one with a panoramic view of the Shinjuku skyline. As they passed Chloe's station, the elderly woman stumbled slightly, her hand flying to her companion's arm. He steadied her instantly, his movement a fluid, controlled display of strength. His attention was entirely on her, a brief, unguarded moment where the cold facade cracked to reveal something fiercely protective. Chloe's manager hissed her name from across the room, a frantic gesture for her to get back to work. But she was rooted to the spot, watching the old woman. She looked like someone's grandmother, kind and overwhelmed. On impulse, an instinct born from a childhood spent bridging two cultures, Chloe stepped forward. She knew it was a breach of protocol. She was just a waitress. She was supposed to be furniture. She stopped a respectable distance from the group, bowed her head just so, a gesture of respect so deeply ingrained it was second nature. The two guards tensed, their hands twitching inside their jackets. The man in the Tom Ford suit didn't even register her presence. His focus remained on his mother. Chloe lifted her head and spoke, her voice soft but clear, aimed only at the woman in beige. She didn't use the casual, clipped Japanese of the city streets. She used the formal, honorific language, the beautiful, respectful cadence taught to her by the woman who had raised her. "Welcome to our restaurant, madam. I hope your evening is a pleasant one." Silence. It was not a normal silence. It was a vacuum, sucking the air and the ambient noise from the entire dining room. The clink of silverware stopped. The low hum of conversation died. The man's head snapped toward her. For the first time, she met his eyes. They were dark, almost black, and held a stillness that was more terrifying than any overt threat. They weren't angry. They were analytical, surgical. He looked at her not as a person, but as an anomaly, a variable that had suddenly appeared in a perfectly controlled equation. The room held its breath, waiting for a verdict she didn't understand. One of his guards leaned in, whispering urgently. The boss didn't look away from Chloe. He lifted a single, manicured hand, a gesture of dismissal that was absolute. The guard fell silent and stepped back. He studied her for another long second, his gaze sweeping over her dark skin, her neatly braided hair, the simple black uniform. He was taking her apart piece by piece, searching for the trick, the angle. He found none. There was only a young woman who had offered a polite greeting. Finally he spoke. His voice was a low baritone, smooth as polished granite. "You will serve our table tonight," he said. It was not a question or a request. It was a statement of fact. No one else. Chloe's manager, who had scurried over, began to protest. "Sir, she is one of our junior staff. I can assign you our most senior server." The man's gaze remained locked on Chloe, but his next words cut her manager off like a blade. "I was not speaking to you." The manager paled and practically dissolved into the carpet. Chloe could only nod, her throat suddenly tight. She felt the weight of every eye in the room on her, a suffocating pressure. That was the moment her ordinary world fractured. She had simply been polite to an old woman, but in doing so, she had stepped onto a stage she never wanted, under a spotlight that felt like an interrogation lamp. And the man watching her, the man whose silent authority could stop a room cold, was not going to let her leave. The rest of the night passed in a surreal haze. Chloe served the private room, her movements precise and automatic, a dance she had perfected through hundreds of shifts. But tonight, the air was thick with unspoken tension. She was aware of him, Ryo Tanaka, in a way that felt like a physical presence against her skin. He didn't watch her overtly, his attention devoted to his mother, but she felt his awareness of her every move, the way she poured the sake, the placement of a dish, the quiet clearing of plates. His mother, Mrs. Tanaka, was the only source of warmth in the room. She would smile at Chloe, a gentle crinkling of the eyes, and offer soft words of thanks for each course. Chloe would respond in kind, their conversation a small, polite bubble in the ocean of cold silence maintained by the men. Each time she spoke, she felt Ryo's attention sharpen, a subtle shift in his posture, the barest narrowing of his eyes. When the meal was over and the party prepared to leave, Mrs. Tanaka reached out and took Chloe's hand. Her skin was soft and papery. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice kind. It was a pleasure to be served by someone with such a beautiful heart. Chloe's professional mask almost slipped. She squeezed the old woman's hand gently. "The pleasure was all mine, madam." As they left, Ryo paused at the door. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "What is your name?" "Chloe," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He held her gaze for a moment longer. "Chloe," he repeated, and the way he said it was different. It sounded less like a name and more like a possession he was cataloging. Then he was gone. She thought that was the end of it. A strange, unsettling encounter she would try to forget. She finished her shift, the sympathetic and fearful looks from her co-workers following her as she cleaned her station. She changed out of her uniform, the cheap polyester sticking to her skin, and walked out the service exit into the cool Tokyo night. He was there, leaning against a black, impossibly sleek sedan, the kind that looked like it could outrun the wind. The streetlight caught the silver of his signet ring. His two guards stood like statues at either end of the car. Her heart didn't race. It seized, a cold knot of dread in her stomach. This was wrong. This was dangerous. She turned to walk the other way, to blend into the late-night crowds of Shinjuku, but his voice stopped her. "Don't." It was quiet, but it carried the unmistakable weight of command. She froze, her back to him. "My mother was impressed by you," he said, his voice closer now. He had moved without a sound. "She does not impress easily." Chloe remained silent, her mind racing.
What did he want? A picture tip?
An apology for her presumption. "You are not Japanese," he stated, "but you speak the language of her generation, the language of respect. Where did you learn it?" She finally turned to face him. "I was raised here." Her voice was steady, betraying none of the fear coiling inside her. He took a step closer. The air grew colder. He smelled of cedar and something else, something metallic and clean, like rain on steel. "That is not an answer." "It's the only one I have," she said, lifting her chin. She was 18 years old, a waitress, an orphan, a foreigner. She had nothing, but she had this, a spine of steel forged in a life of being other. A flicker of something, not respect, perhaps, but interest. crossed his face. It was there, and gone in an instant. Get in the car. No, she said, the word tasting like recklessness. His lips curved into something that was not a smile. It was a predator's acknowledgement of its prey's spirit. That was not a request, Chloe. You have become a person of interest. And I do not leave such things to chance, he gestured to the car. You will answer my questions. And then, if you are what you appear to be, you will go home. If you are not. He let the sentence hang in the air, a threat more potent for being unspoken. She knew she had no choice. To run would be an admission of guilt for a crime she hadn't committed. To argue would be pointless. With a deep, steadying breath, she walked to the car. One of the guards opened the rear door for her. The interior was black leather and silence. Rio slid in beside her, and the door closed with a heavy, final thud, sealing her in with the most dangerous man in Tokyo. The car moved through the neon-drenched streets of Shinjuku, a silent black shark in a river of light. Chloe stared out the window, watching the familiar world slide by, feeling as if she were looking at it from behind a pane of thick glass. The man beside her said nothing. The silence was a weapon, designed to unnerve her, to make her babble and fill the void. She refused to give him the satisfaction. She focused on her breathing, on the rhythmic pulse in her own veins. They arrived at a skyscraper that pierced the clouds, a monument of steel and glass. An elevator took them to the penthouse, the ride so smooth and silent it felt like an ascent into another realm. The apartment was a study in minimalist perfection, dark wood floors, vast windows showcasing the glittering city, and furniture so sparse and elegant it looked like art. Rio gestured to a low leather sofa.
Seat.
She sat on the edge, her back straight. He didn't sit. He paced before the window, a caged tiger outlined against the city lights. Start from the beginning, he commanded.
Who are you?
I told you. My name is Chloe. I work at Murasaka. That is what you do. It is not who you are, he countered, his voice sharp. No foreign girl who waits tables for a living speaks the way you do. It is a language of the old families, of tradition. You spoke to my mother as if you were raised in her house. The observation was so unnervingly accurate it startled her. I was an orphan, she said, the words feeling thin and hollow in the vast room. My parents were American diplomats. They died in a car crash when I was 3. I was raised in a foster home. My foster mother, she was an old woman. Traditional. She taught me. He stopped pacing and turned to face her fully. His dark eyes searched hers, looking for the lie. Your foster mother's name? Yuki Sato, Chloe said. She passed away 2 years ago. Rio was still for a long moment. He pulled a phone from his pocket, his thumb moving across the screen with silent efficiency. He was vetting her story, running the name, checking the facts. Chloe waited, her hands clenched in her lap. She had told the truth. But in his world, the truth was a commodity, to be verified and weighed. After a few minutes, he lowered the phone. A fraction of the tension in his shoulders seemed to release. The story is clean, he sounded almost disappointed. It's not a story, she said quietly. He ignored her. You are an anomaly. A loose thread. I don't like loose threads. Before she could ask what that meant, a sound split the air, a sharp crack, followed by the spider webbing of the reinforced glass window just to Rio's left. Instinct, not thought, propelled him. In a single, explosive movement, he crossed the room and slammed into her, driving her off the sofa and onto the floor. His body was a solid, unyielding weight on top of her, shielding her from whatever was to come. The scent of cedar and steel filled her senses. She felt the hard muscle of his chest, the press of his thigh against hers, the surprising heat of him. Her mind reeled. A gunshot. Someone had shot at him. At them. He was already speaking, his voice a low, urgent whisper against her ear, his breath warm on her skin. Stay down. Don't move. 2 of his men burst into the room, guns drawn, their movements a blur of deadly efficiency. They took positions, their eyes scanning the cityscape for the sniper's nest. Ishikawa. One of the men growled. Rio didn't respond. He remained over Chloe, a human shield, his body tense and coiled like a spring. She was trapped beneath him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel his own heartbeat, a steady, controlled rhythm against her back. He was not afraid. He was focused. This was his language. Violence. When the immediate threat seemed to have passed, he shifted his weight, rolling off her. He stood up, brushing a piece of invisible dust from his perfect suit. He looked at the fractured window, his expression cold and calculating. Then his eyes fell on her. He saw the small, bright red line on her forearm where a shard of flying glass had sliced her skin. He knelt beside her, his movements surprisingly fluid. Before she could protest, he took her arm, his grip firm but gentle. His thumb brushed against the cut, and she flinched. He produced a pristine white handkerchief from his breast pocket and carefully pressed it against the wound. It was the first moment of unexpected tenderness, a small, almost deniable gesture of care in the midst of chaos. His head was bent, his focus entirely on the small injury. In that moment, the formidable Yakuza boss was just a man, tending to a wound. "They will think you are with me now," he said, his voice low, almost a murmur. "Seeing you with my mother, having you brought here, they will assume you are important." His eyes met hers, and she saw a flicker of something haunted in their depths. "They will see you as a vulnerability, a weakness." He was not just talking about her. Chloe understood, with a sudden, chilling clarity. He was talking about someone else. A memory. A ghost. "I had a sister," he said, the words clipped, as if they were being forcibly torn from him. "Her name was Akari. She was killed. A sniper. Just like this. It was meant for me." She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The shame he carried was a palpable thing, a cold aura that emanated from him. The wound he carried wasn't physical, it was a failure to protect. He looked at Chloe, and she knew he wasn't just seeing her. He was seeing a ghost, a mistake he was determined not to repeat. The danger outside was real, but the danger inside this room, the danger of being seen by this man, of being tied to his past, felt infinitely more complex. She could have run in the chaos. She could have screamed or tried to flee. But looking at the raw pain he kept so carefully buried, she made a choice. She took the handkerchief from him. "Let me," she said softly. Her hands were steady as she wrapped it securely around her own arm, tying a neat knot. When she was done, she looked up at him. "You're bleeding too." He glanced down at his side, where a dark stain was beginning to bloom on the fine gray wool of his suit jacket. A piece of shrapnel from the window frame must have grazed him. He hadn't even seemed to notice. She stood up, her earlier fear replaced by a strange, focused calm. "Sit down," she said. It wasn't a command, but it wasn't a suggestion either. For the second time that night, he looked at her with that assessing, surprised expression. And for the second time, he did as she said, sitting on the edge of the sofa. Chloe went to the pristine bathroom, found a first aid kit, and came back. She knelt before him and carefully cut away the fabric of his shirt. The wound was shallow, a long, angry scrape along his ribs, but it was bleeding freely. Her touch was professional, impersonal, but the proximity was not. She was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. She cleaned the wound, her movements deft and sure, and he watched her, his face a mask of stone. But his eyes followed her every move. The charged silence between them was a living thing, filled with the scent of antiseptic, the distant wail of sirens, and the weight of his stare. In that moment, she wasn't just a waitress. She was the only person in his fortress, the only one touching him, tending to the damage his world had inflicted. And she had chosen not to run. The days that followed blurred into a strange, new reality. Chloe did not go home.
Rio was clear about that.
Her apartment was being watched by the Ishikawagumi. Her life as a waitress was over. The moment that sniper's bullet shattered the glass, it had shattered her old world along with it. She was now a permanent resident of his gilded cage, a penthouse that felt more like a luxurious prison. He gave her a room, a suite of her own with a bed softer than a cloud and a view that stretched to the horizon. He bought her clothes, beautiful things delivered in silent boxes, fabrics and styles she could never have afforded. It was a life of quiet opulence, and it was utterly terrifying. She was a possession, a problem he was managing. During the day, he was gone, swallowed by the city and the violent business of his empire. At night, he would return, and they would often share a silent meal, served by a staff that moved like ghosts. They rarely spoke, but the silence was different now. It was no longer just empty space. It was filled with a growing awareness. She would catch him watching her, his expression thoughtful, almost brooding. She would find herself studying the hard lines of his face, the way his long fingers held a glass, the flicker of exhaustion in his eyes that he hid from everyone else. One evening, there was an ambush. Rio was called to a meeting, and he took her with him. "You are safer with me," he'd said, and the words held a grim finality. They were leaving a parking garage when two black cars boxed them in. The world erupted in gunfire and the screech of tires. Rio's driver was skilled, but they were trapped. "There's a service alley," Chloe said suddenly, her voice sharp and clear over the chaos. "2 blocks east of here. It cuts through to the old market. They won't be able to follow us through there." Rio looked at her, his eyes narrowed. "How do you know?" "I grew up in these streets," she shot back. "I know the shortcuts. Turn left here."
Now.
The driver, glancing at Rio for confirmation and receiving a sharp nod, wrenched the wheel. They careened down a narrow street, sideswiping dumpsters. The pursuing cars were too large to follow. They had escaped the initial trap, but they were on foot now, the sound of shouting men behind them. Rio grabbed her hand, his grip like iron, and pulled her into the labyrinthine alleys of Shinjuku. They ran, the neon lights of the city flashing above them, casting long, dancing shadows. They were almost clear when 2 men appeared at the end of the alley, blocking their path. They were cornered. Rio pushed her behind him, drawing a sleek, dark pistol from the small of his back. He moved with a lethal grace that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. But Chloe's mind was racing. She saw a red fire alarm box on the wall of the building beside them. Without a second thought, she broke away from Rio, lunged for it, and pulled the lever. A deafening alarm bell began to clang, echoing through the narrow space. Doors opened, people began to shout. The chaos she had unleashed was immediate and overwhelming. The 2 gunmen were momentarily confused, their attention diverted by the sudden flood of panicked civilians into the alley. It was the opening they needed. Rio grabbed her again, and they plunged into the throng, using the screaming, running crowd as cover. They didn't stop until they were several blocks away, hidden in the shadows of a quiet shrine. Chloe leaned against the cold stone wall, her lungs burning, her body trembling with adrenaline.
She had done that.
She had endangered innocent people, created a panic, all to save them. A line had been crossed. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was a participant. Rio stood watching her, his chest rising and falling. He wasn't even out of breath. He stepped closer, reaching out to tuck a stray braid behind her ear. His fingers brushed against her skin, a touch that sent a jolt through her entire body. "My sister," he said, his voice rough. She would have panicked. She would have screamed. He looked down at her, and the mask was gone. In his eyes, she saw a raw, dangerous honesty. "You are not her." "I know," Chloe whispered, her voice shaking. "I keep you here and tell myself it is for your protection," he continued, his gaze intense. "To prevent a repeat of my failure. I am lying to myself." Her breath hitched. This was it. The confession. Not of love, but of something deeper, more complicated. A recognition. A claim. "Why, then?" she asked, needing to hear it. "Because when you look at me," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you do not look away. Everyone else looks away." He saw the monster, and she did not flinch. That, to him, was more seductive than any beauty, more valuable than any loyalty he could buy. The next day, the Ishikawagumi made their move. It wasn't an attack. It was a message. A package was delivered to Rio. Inside was a single photograph. It was of an elderly couple, smiling, standing in front of a small, neat house. Chloe knew them instantly. Her foster grandparents. Yuki Sato's parents. They had taken her in on weekends, taught her to cook, treated her like their own flesh and blood. They were the only family she had left. And now Rio's enemies had found them. The war was no longer his. It was hers. The air in the penthouse was thick with the promise of violence. Rio stood before the window, his back to her, the photograph on the table between them. He had been silent for an hour, a stillness more menacing than any rage. His soldiers moved in and out of the room, speaking in hushed, urgent tones, their reports painting a grim picture. The Ishikawa clan had her foster grandparents. They were offering a trade, the old couple for a piece of his territory in Ginza. Everyone knew it was a trap, a public execution to shame him, to break his power. They will not be harmed, Rio said, his voice a low rumble. I will give them what they want. No, Chloe said, stepping forward. Her voice didn't waver. You can't. It's a sign of weakness. They'll use it to destroy you. And they won't let them go anyway. They're leverage. He turned to face her, his eyes black holes of fury. This is my world. You do not understand its rules. I understand them better than you think, she countered, her gaze unwavering. They chose them because they are my family, because they are your weakness. But they made a mistake. They think I'm a weakness, too. She walked to the table and picked up the photograph, her fingers tracing the kind, wrinkled faces. The meeting place. Where is it? You are not going, the words were absolute. They are my family, she repeated, her voice fierce. I am not a girl you need to hide. I am not your sister. I am the weapon they didn't see coming. He stared at her, a war raging behind his eyes. He saw the terrified waitress from that first night, but he also saw the woman who had navigated them through a firefight, who had faced him down without flinching. He saw the strength he had mistaken for mere survival instinct. The old Tsukiji fish market, he said, finally relenting. At dawn. Chloe nodded. I used to work there, summers, helping my grandfather with his stall. I know every inch of that place. Every tunnel, every warehouse. A plan began to form in her mind, born of desperation and an intimate knowledge of the enemy's chosen battlefield. She was not a soldier. She did not carry a gun. But she had a different kind of power. Dawn broke gray and cold over Tokyo Bay. The abandoned fish market was a ghost town of empty stalls and echoing warehouses, smelling of salt and decay. Chloe walked into the cavernous central building, her steps echoing in the silence. She was alone, just as they'd demanded. The Ishikawa boss, a portly man with cruel eyes, sat on a crate, flanked by a dozen of his men. In the corner, tied to chairs, were her foster grandparents. Their eyes were wide with fear. The girl arrives, Ishikawa sneered. Where is your master? He is not my master, Chloe said, her voice carrying in the quiet space. And he is not coming. Ishikawa laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. A foolish choice. He sacrifices you all for a piece of land. No, Chloe said, her gaze steady. He trusted me. She held up a small, innocuous-looking audio recorder. I have a recording. A conversation between you and the head of the Kudo clan. The one you swore a blood oath to. The one you're planning to betray next week. The sneer vanished from Ishikawa's face. His eyes darted nervously to his own men. Lies. A trick. Is it? Chloe asked calmly. Your lieutenant doesn't seem to think so. He's the one who sold it to us. She pressed a button. A voice filled the warehouse. Ishikawa's voice, full of arrogant plotting, detailing the betrayal of his allies. The effect was instantaneous. The Ishikawa men looked at their boss, then at each other. Their loyalty, built on fear and a fragile code of honor, was fracturing before his eyes. He had betrayed one of their own. Who would be next? Kill her. Ishikawa screamed, his face purple with rage. But before his men could decide where their loyalties now lay, The shadows at the edge of the warehouse moved. Rio's men emerged from the darkness, silent and lethal. They were outnumbered, but they moved with a singular, deadly purpose. The ensuing fight was brutal and short. The Ishikawa clan, divided and confused, fell apart. Rio himself appeared at Chloe's side, his eyes only for her. He ignored the chaos around them, his entire world narrowing to her face. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. It was a gesture of profound possession, of absolute acknowledgement, made in the middle of a war zone. "You are magnificent," he breathed. In the aftermath, Chloe rushed to her grandparents, untying them, her hands trembling now that the danger was past. They were shaken but unharmed. The cost was paid. Her old life, and theirs, was irrevocably gone. For their own safety, Rio arranged for them to be moved, given a new life in a quiet town where no one would ever find them. Chloe said goodbye at a private airfield, a heartbreaking farewell filled with tears and whispered promises. She watched the plane disappear into the clouds, taking the last piece of her past with it. She was truly alone now, except for him. That night, she stood on the penthouse balcony, the city a river of diamonds below. The immediate threat was gone. The Ishikawa clan was broken. But the world she now inhabited was one of constant, simmering danger. She heard him approach, felt his presence behind her before she saw him. He didn't touch her, but he stood so close she could feel the warmth of his body, a solid wall at her back. "This world," he said, his voice a low murmur against the wind. "It takes everything." It was an apology, a warning, an admission. Chloe didn't turn. She kept her eyes on the endless, glittering expanse of Tokyo, the city that had taken her parents, the city that had given her a family and then taken them, too, the city that had brought her to him. "I know," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was not a sound of defeat. It was a sound of acceptance, of a choice made. "I'm still here."